Hello, and welcome to On Point. I'm Natalie Gonzalez. Today's media audiences have so many more choices than they used to. 50 years ago, media content was designed for the lowest common denominator, to attract as many people as possible and offend as few. News media were expected to be credible and informative, not necessarily profitable. This changed the 1980s when cable technology gave audiences more choices, competition increased, and regulation decreased. Media were forced to be satisfied with much smaller audiences, and they had to find new ways of attracting those now segmented audiences. One of those ways for news media was with a talk show format rather than straight and objective news reporting. And sometimes that meant expressing opinions that in former times might have been called offensive to many segments of the audience. Veteran journalist and media critic Deggans attempts to decode the ways media outlets profit by segmenting fellow Americans in his new book called Race Baiter, an exploration of the way the media use stereotypes to divide the nation. Deggans dissects the powerful ways modern media have fed fear, prejudice, and hate throughout the history. Deggans calls a race baiter any person who uses racial tensions to arouse a particular audience demographic. Many journalism students on the CSUN campus were assigned to read Deggans' book in some of their classes. Deggans sat down with On Point reporter Tommy Fuller to discuss his book, his perception of the media, and the role they play in our everyday lives.
I see an evolution of depictions of all people of color on television, but it's curious. Sometimes it's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In the book, I write about these characters that I call the black best friend that we see on TV shows all the time. So there's a lot of supporting characters out there whose job is mostly to help the main character, who's usually a white person, usually a white male. And there are some shows that are starting to break that. We saw Deception on NBC, where the lead and her love interest were both people of color. We have Scandal on ABC, where the lead is a woman of color, which is really unusual. We don't get to see black women starring in shows all their own. And we see some strong black characters of color in shows like Southland, with Regina King's character in particular is pretty strong. So there's some shows that are breaking that mold, but there are other shows where you see hardly any people of color. You know, I think about Mad Men. You know, even a show like Walking Dead has its controversies over race because some of its characters of color seem to get killed off pretty quickly, and for some reason or another they don't seem to be essential to the story. So so I think it's an ever evolving thing, and sometimes it gets better, but just when you think things are getting better, you know, you look around and you don't see nearly as much diversity as you thought there should be.
You had a list of reality TV and how minorities, so-called list, the lies, the major lies of reality TV.
Sure.
Can you go ahead and elaborate for our viewers what that list pertains?
When you talk to somebody who watches reality TV, of course, they know that a lot of it is contrived. But I still think that people sort of unconsciously believe a lot of stuff that's presented to them. And my point is simply that a lot of the stuff that these reality shows try to present as some sort of truth are really not only fake, but just completely contrived and almost a lie to viewers. A lot of the confrontations are staged. They do have writers. They don't call them writers, but they do sort of plot out situations. They retake scenes. You know, if somebody says something and it doesn't come out quite right, they ask them to say it again and say it again. I mean, you know, there's not really much difference between what they do and a scripted sitcom, except the people at the center of it are not professional performers, so they don't get paid like professional performers, so it's a lot cheaper. One of the things that bothers me the most is that the producers who make the shows don't acknowledge their own influence or presence whenever they're filming anything. In documentaries even, if the camera is a disruptive presence or if the producer has set something up, they will let the viewer know how they've set up a situation that the viewer is seeing. But reality TV producers don't do that. So I do think that it's important for viewers to constantly remind themselves of the stereotypes and the prejudices that these shows are built around. When you watch My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, you know, you're being shown a really stereotypical, really insulting, really damaging view of a subculture that some people are really proud of. And, you know, if they did that with black people, you know, there'd be 20 groups lined up to protest. But because they do it to these subcultures that are smaller and then don't necessarily view themselves that way, like gypsies and the Amish and Southern people, Southern white people, working class Southern white people. They don't complain as much. I do think you have to keep them in perspective. You have to constantly remind yourself when you're watching these shows that they're incredibly contrived, that you don't see a minute that isn't planned, that nothing is spontaneous, and that there are some really damaging stereotypes at the heart of some of these shows. If you keep that in mind and sort of watch them in moderation, I think you can keep a perspective that's important.
Yeah. I kind of want to parlay over to leave the Hollywood side and go over to the news side. Sure. And from what I can remember, forgive me for being young, back in the 90s, CNN and all the major news networks kind of did a transition from hard news coverage to more of their traditional sit-down talk show news, where you have the commentator and the panel of guests talking about an issue instead of reporting an issue. And how do you feel like pretty much the rat race for ratings, you know, people want to reconfirm what they already believe. How is this reflecting negatively on, you know, our progression of race in America?
I mean, in the early 90s, we only had one cable news channel, that was CNN. And the news was defined as something that you reported on. And Fox was trying to create a cable news channel of its own, and they didn't have the money or didn't want to spend the money to develop the same kind of reporting infrastructure that CNN had. So the question becomes, if you're going to create a cable channel and you want to compete with the best reporters on the block, what do? Well, they changed the game, and they changed cable TV news from reporting the news to talking about the news. By the time you get to prime time, by the time you get to 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, everybody already knows what the news is. You've seen it on your iPhone, you've seen it online, you've heard about it throughout the day. So by the time you get to the end of the day, you already know what the news is. You don't need somebody to report the news. You need somebody to tell you what to think about the news. Yeah. Or more importantly, you're drawn to somebody who echoes what you think about the news, right? Now, in the book, I quote a study by the Brookings Institution that found that 46% of the people they polled felt that it's just as likely that white people would be discriminated against because of their color as people of color, as black people. But when you ask Fox News viewers, that percentage rises to 70%. So there's a sense that this is an audience that doesn't believe in institutional racism. They believe everything's equal. They're very suspicious of civil rights activists and people who claim that there's still big problems with race in America. So that's the way Fox talks about race. Now, whether or not that's accurate, that's the way they choose to talk about race, because that's the way their audience sees the issue.
You also talk about Bill O'Reilly, your ever-evolving relationship with Bill O'Reilly. And I pulled this quote. I loved this quote. He says, "This is post-Hurricane Katrina. And then every teacher should tell the students, if I refuse to learn, if I refuse to work hard, if you become addicted, if you live the gangster life, you will be poor, powerless, like many of those seen in New Orleans." Like, these are what he said. Yeah, and after he said this, of course, you wrote about it, and then he's attacking you for being
several people who I felt were leveraging prejudice and stereotypes when they were talking about Hurricane Katrina. And the thing about Bill O'Reilly is that I feel like half the time what he's trying to say has a lot of merit. If the message is, educate yourself and try to succeed in life so that you don't get stuck in New Orleans when the next hurricane hits, that's a great message. Yeah. But to turn that around and make it a racial thing, what you do when you put in that sort of gangsta, tag, I think you do a disservice to the issue, and then you wind up stereotyping people. I think he has a problem with certain elements of black culture, particularly hip-hop culture. And he's constantly trying to make the point that culture is to blame for some of the ills that affect black people. And I'm just not sure that it's that simple. Yeah. And I do believe that there are a lot of people who value hip-hop culture and don't want to see it demonized, particularly by somebody like Bill O'Reilly, who doesn't seem to understand it or want to understand it. And I saw him in that special that he talked about grilling Russell Simmons, the longtime rap producer, and he was telling him about illiteracy statistics for black children and saying, you know, what are you doing about this? And number one, like it's a music artist's job to educate kids.
Yeah.
But at the time, Russell Simmons had Deaf Poetry Jam on HBO, where he was encouraging poets. He was showcasing poets, and they had just put out a book of poetry. Yeah. So as a matter of fact, he was encouraging people to read. You know, of course, the show didn't say that. You know, so I just feel like when you get wrapped up in stereotypes, you wind up creating these inaccurate reports, and then people get this misleading view of what a culture is like. And you know, some of the stuff Bill O'Reilly does is I think a perfect example. Sometimes he tries to be on the right side of the issue, but because he's not taking the time to root out the stereotypes in what he's doing, he winds up making mistakes.
On Point's Tommy Fuller has more on the story.
Thank you, Natalie, for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to welcome our two guests to the studio. To the left of me, I have Dr. Teresa Williams-Leon, PhD in sociology and a professor of Asian American Studies. We also have Joe Hicks, who is the vice president of the Community Advocates Incorporated. I'd like to get the show rolling right off the bat here. In the early 90s, there was a transition from the CNN report the news format to a more traditional, what we see now today, the Fox News talk about the issues rather than report the issues. Do you feel that this transition of news reporting is killing objectivity?
Go ahead.
Well, I guess it's assuming that there was objectivity from the get-go, right? There's a cloak of objectivity, and there seems to be this sense that, you know, when you have one position, then you have to offer another. But certainly I think it's exacerbated by these talking heads who sort of spurt their, you know, personal views, and then these think tanks, right, that have, you know, certain political agendas who send out their speakers, right? So.
All right. Do you have anything to add to that, Jeff?
Well, yeah, I mean, the creation of 24-hour news channels, I think, was a big change in American media. And I would agree with Teresa. I'm not sure this whole notion of objectivity ever really existed in American media. We're a long way from Edward R. Murrow and those kind of days when, you know, there was that pretense of that sort of thing, but we're way past that. You know, the New York Times long ago obviously established they're a liberal-directed newspaper. It's clearly what they are. But it's interesting. So now we have not only Fox, you mentioned Fox, MSNBC is probably more venal and nasty in their political views than Fox is. You know, there's a recent poll that indicated that most American media consumers do view MSNBC as being the more ideological. But CNN certainly has its slant on things. But here's the problem. And all these channels, I think they have their news organs, which attempt to deliver news. They do it for better or worse. But then they have these shows that are all about individuals' views. And there are opinion shows. So you have Bill O'Reilly on Fox, and you have their regular news. MSNBC clearly does fairly straight news. And then you got a Chris Matthews, who's a bumbling fool. So you have these individuals who, as you indicated, spew their views about things, but they try to balance it, all of them do, for better or worse, with their sort of straight news show. And I guess it's up to all of us to figure out how well they do at that. I would argue they don't do it very well.
I'm going to kind of piggyback on that towards staying with the cable network newses, and in entertainment in general, how these different channels are stereotyping Americans for programming. We talk about the E! channel, how it targets women, and how they create programming for women. Well, how do they do this? They do it through stereotyping women, and they create their rundown. Is this, we try to get away from racial stereotypes, but obviously it's there every single day. How is this affecting the progression of our society? Joe, would you like to take that away?
Well, all these are looking for various niches, you know, that they can occupy, and they try to program for a particular market. You know, there's, you know, as you indicate, there are these networks that try to pick a particular slice of the population, women, BTs trying to hook it up with, you know, a black perspective, supposedly. So they're trying to find this niche that they can fit in and get some eyeballs on the screen. So everybody's doing that to one extent or another. Some are obvious because it's clear that you're attempting to do either ethnic or gender kind of programming. Now, do they engage in stereotyping? Well, I would argue that a lot of what BET does is engage in stereotyping. Does MSNBC do that? Well, of course they do. But then you have CNN that, Soledad O'Brien has been doing a series on Black in America that was an interesting show. If you sort of try to break it down and try to figure out what is Soledad and what is CNN trying to actually present in terms of that attempt to figure out what is it to be Black in America?
Yeah.
What is that?
To take that away, is this dangerous? This mass stereotyping? Do you see this as being very dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. I think stereotypes really serve sort of an ideological function to kind of place people, in particular social location within the society. So absolutely. I mean, I always think of stereotyping as kind of this. You have your social patterns where you can look at, you can empirically demonstrate certain things. 1 out of, 4 women who are, murdered are murdered, by their male partners or something like that. But the stereotype version, right, you can empirically prove or disprove whether that statistic is, factual or not. But a stereotype is then to say, well, all men are violent, or men are violent, right? Or, black men are violent, or brown men are violent. The point where I would take issue with Mr. Hicks is that I think we have to understand media within the context of, multinational capitalism. I mean, we don't really have news, right? I mean, it's really about entertainment. It's about selling products, right? So in the end, that's what, whether it's MSNBC or CNN or Fox, right? They have a particular audience, and advertisers are trying to sell certain kinds of products. So, media the media serves, and I'm coming from sort of a different ideological point of view, but certainly if we look at, say, like the work of Noam Chomsky, right? He would argue that, this whole myth, right? It's a myth that, there's a liberal bias in the media, whether it's, New York Times or what have you. So, but I think our conclusion is similar in terms of what, the role of the media, even though perhaps we may be coming from different perspectives.
Are we agreeing that the media is, through stereotypes and other dimensions, is polarizing America towards left or right?
No, I'm not sure I agree with that. Okay. I mean, see, here's what's interesting. You talk about capitalism and their nefarious ways here, but here's the problem. There's so much media being thrown at us. See, back in the day, you had 3 or 4 media organs. You had NBC, ABC, CBS, and there may have been CNN hooked in there somewhere. But so, we have so, democracy's basically taken over now. I don't need to just go to ABC or CNN to get my news. I can go on blogs. I can go on all kind of websites. I have information and media at my fingertips, which is why, LA Times is just about broke because nobody's buying the sucker. Because we have people now have so many ways to get information, news and information, that is creating havoc in the old world where it was spoon-fed to us in various kind of ways and we had no other real alternative. Now we can go everywhere and get information. If I just wanted to read conservative websites, I could do that. If I wanted to just read Noam Chomsky and that kind of direction in terms of the world, I could do that. Or if I was a smart person, I'd balance it all, and that would help me figure out what I thought about the world. And I think more and more young people are doing that. They're getting their information from various kinds of pieces and all over the map. Facebook even, I mean, social media. All that figures into how younger people begin to form their ideas about the world. Now, are they influenced? Well, of course they are, because there is a bias, whether it's right or left. There is a bias in a lot of the media that gets presented. But people are smart to begin to figure this out. But I want to come back to your notion of stereotyping. What is stereotyping, and how does it get presented? What does that mean? I mean, it's almost kind of a construct to sort of push that out there and say, well, people engaging in stereotyping. Well, what do you mean? Let me give you an example of how you can turn this on your head. I'm watching MSNBC, and Toure, who's a former media critic who's got a show, is talking about Ben Carson, who's a black doctor, a pediatric neurosurgeon, who apparently has taken sort of a conservative take on his politics now. He gave a speech at a prayer breakfast where Obama was at and took him to task for Obamacare and on and on. Well, Teresa then basically called this guy an Uncle Tom. So my take on that is, what does it mean to be black, and what is a stereotype? Because black people, Asians, Latinos, gay people come in all kinds of stripes, and there's no authentic anybody, because in essence what Teresa was saying was, well, Ben Carson is an authentic black man because he doesn't think in the predominant ways that black people, quote unquote, are supposed to think. So he then engaged in the old game of throwing names at this guy. But so, you know, we have to, I think, really have those kind of discussions about all those kind of things about authenticity and what does it mean to be representative of any particular slice of American population. Yeah. So we have to really pick apart, I guess my main point, we have to pick apart with this, because it's not 1930 where you got people in blackface and or you know, acting like buffoons and the kinds of things, or if you saw them, they're always playing the role of a prostitute or pimp or a thief. That ain't happening. You're seeing black people portrayed as doctors and lawyers and cops and judges and all sorts of things. So all that's breaking down. So what do we mean when we say that the media is stereotyping any particular group? And that's the question.
When I was talking to Eric Deggans, author of Race Baiter, we had a conversation about the show Cops. And first, you know, revolutionary in the reality TV. But the danger of the show was when you saw the criminals portrayed, they were African American minorities in poor neighborhoods. And as myself, not being African American, growing up in, I guess, what you would call a suburban area, this is the view that young children develop of, say, a black man. You know, they're criminals, things like this. So the media, in essence, is playing a dangerous game. What is the dangers of, you know, broadcasting on a large scale these types of stereotypes that could be potentially damaging?
Well, here's the problem with stereotypes, is that even in the face of what Mr. Hicks was talking about, that there are all these different portrayals of African Americans, you know, judges, doctors, lawyers, and so on, and yet, and people who know, you know, a president who is part, you know, African American and so on, and yet there's this whole sort of backdrop of a history and a structure of society that, you know, even in the face of these facts and these realities, that people still, rather than saying, oh, my stereotype was wrong, that, you know, all African Americans are criminals, or all Latinos are gang members, or, you know, all Asian Americans are, you know, super wealthy, and so on, right? That what ends up happening is people start saying, oh, I'm still going to hang on to my stereotype, and then you become the exception. And so, you know, there's this whole sort of structure, history, context from which to understand the stereotypes that, you know, again, I go back to that point that they serve as an ideological function, you know, to place people in you know, certain locations within the society.
But here's the thing about that. The Pew poll just did a study late last year that America is the least segregated it has ever been right now. Let's go back to your Cops analogy.
But that's not saying much when we're so segregated.
Well, but we're away from the 1940s, because I mean, there are people who actually lived those days.
Yeah.
Now, you know, Cops was never one of my favorite kind of shows. I didn't sit and go through a six-pack of beer and watch Cops. Maybe some people did. That wasn't my particular kind of show.
Yeah.
But, you know, I sit there and surf like a lot of people do, kind of seeing what's on. And I've caught the show a few times. And I remember seeing a fair amount of toothless white folks out there getting dragged out of cars in Florida.
I do agree with you on that one.
And we got Honey Boo Boo. We got, so, you know, now that could be, again, I would argue, be viewed as a kind of stereotyping of its own.
Right.
That if I'm a well-to-do black person living in Upper Manhattan, I'm watching Honey Boo Boo, and I'm not exposed to a lot of poor white people, I might think, maybe they're all like that.
Yeah.
I would argue that, see, that's just not where we are today, because our worlds are so, even if we don't physically live next to each other, our worlds through media and other kind of experience, our workplace are so integrated, it's you got to be stupider than, let me not use the word here, to look at Cops and go, I bet all them Negroes are just like that.
No, I agree.
That's a tough thing, and you gotta find a way to isolate yourself to then come up with this premise. You may be living on a farm in Mississippi somewhere and have that premise. If you're living in any urban environment in America today, for you to come up with a premise that all black people, or most black people, perform like the people that are dragging out of drug cars in wherever they're finding these folks on that show. So we sometimes engage in our own form of stereotyping to make a certain kind of political point. And I would argue in 2013, we gotta expand, the narrative has got to expand just a bit, I would argue, these days.
I kind of want to change gears here a little bit. In the book, Race Baiter, Eric Deggans talks about hate radio and how the conservative radio, guys like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, how they take issues and they sort of attack the person instead of the issue.
I don't know how, this type of talk radio, in any way uplifts the dialogue, because it's really not about ideas, but it's really about sensation, right? So it's sort of taking an issue and blowing it up, and personal attacks on individuals, and again, certain ideological skews. So yes, I mean, I feel like it sort of overall dumbs down, right, the discourse, I question, really how, the viewing, sort of population, if there are really as many, listeners on a consistent basis as many of the ratings might suggest.
Well, I think it's not terribly helpful. I mean, and again, those shows have the particular markets and their audiences that they cater to. Doesn't work very well because Barack Obama got elected again. So somebody's not being affected all that much by it, or it's not affecting the voting patterns. It's interesting, Deggans, and I haven't read his book, but I've seen him and heard him. It's interesting he would call out, viewpoints that he clearly disagrees with, but that doesn't broaden it to talk about the voices on the other side of that. MSNBC, the stuff that you find on CNN. There's talk radio that is equally as vociferous on the left. Radio America for a while was trying to make their market doing exactly the same thing, except it wasn't funny and people didn't listen to it, so they went broke. So I think it's all part of the big melting pot of ideas that we got to deal with, and it's part of democracy, part of yelling and shouting sometimes at each other. And while it might be coarse and it might be the kind of thing clearly we'd want to engage in here, but it's all part of the stuff. And there's a big thing here. Yeah. If you cruise down the highway and you listen to Rush Limbaugh and he's pissing you off, guess what?
Change the channel.
Change the station.
I want to end with that. Thank you two very much for joining us today. It was a very good topic. I like the discussion, and hopefully we'll see you in here again soon.
Thank you. We would all like to thank you for tuning in to On Point. If you would like to see more, you can follow us on Facebook by searching CSUN On Point, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at CSUN On Point, all one word. This show also appears on our website at csuntvnews.com, or catch us here every Sunday at 4 o'clock. On behalf of Tommy Fuller and all of us here at On Point, I'm Natalie Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.